Hi, hello and welcome to the Old Sword Club's weekly sword lesson related thing. I'm Tim, instructory type person here at the Old Sword Club. Um, normally we do once upon a time we used to do these lessons in person, and now we do them online because we're living through the end times, I guess. But today we're going to be looking at kind of a bit of a historical oddity, which is cutlass, or this is actually technically a saber, but I use it as a cutlass, and pistol. And yes, I don't have an actual pistol, I'm sorry. But this pistol will be very effective if like zombies break in. I don't know. I had to make do. One thing I will note with the pistol is the barrel on this pistol is a lot shorter than the barrel on historical pistols. So there's a lot of time where I do things where if I had a slightly longer barrel, I'd be very covered, but because I don't, I'm just using this because it's what I had. Um, I'm making do. I don't know, I'm very tempted to contact the people who make like custom, rubber band guns or something like that, and see if I can get them to make me a pair of parrying pistols, which is possibly a strange request. Anyway, so the method we're looking at tonight of cutlass and pistol comes from a guy named William Pringle Green, who was a Canadian, although writing in 1812. When Canada was at that point, as far as I know, still a colony rather than an independent country. But he was a naval officer during sort of Napoleonic Wars and before. And he wrote basically a manuscript of his thoughts about how to prepare crew for boarding action, and then which was then never published or never taken up. But we still have the manuscript, and it's kind of cool and unique because it has sword and pistol, which is outside of it's probably the only manual, like technical manual describing the use of sword and pistol that I know of. Certainly of English language manuals. But it's also one of the few manuals from like the Napoleonic period, English language manuals. I should say that I kind of discovered researching this that there's plenty of offhand weapon use in places that weren't Europe during this period, but amongst Europeans and particularly amongst the British, there wasn't really much offhand weapon usage. Like you either had, you might have like a bayonet or a boarding pike, which is a two-handed weapon, but otherwise, it was just, you had a sword, a single-handed sword, and that was that. Which is kind of interesting because there was, shields, offhand dagger, that kind of thing was around in the 18th century. Certainly by the time like anyone who Pringle Green could have potentially met in his life was around, it was like a vestigial thing carried on either by sort of like the Scottish Highlanders or like as a kind of a traditional thing in fencing schools. But it's still like, it was still kind of there. And what I find kind of interesting as well is in Belleville, a manual we looked at a couple of weeks ago, I stopped up where the videos from, sorry. Belleville depicts a guard, what he calls the guard of the Scottish Highlander, which is just a cudgeling guard where the Highlander has basically a piece of wood tied to his arm that he's using to protect his head, and the guard is very, very similar to that that Pringle Green proposes, which has led some people, the originator theory was Paul Wagner of the Staccato School of Defence, to suggest that maybe Pringle Green got the idea from encountering someone who had done at that point, fairly vestigial kind of like out-of-date form or like, old-fashioned form of Highland broadsword. Anyway, so the other thing I should probably mention with this as an introduction is this is not necessarily indicative of sword fighting of the period. I think one of the things I realized researching Pringle Green is that he's a bit outside the norm, and if you wanted to learn maybe what was a more common method of like cutlass use, you'd be looking at something like Angelo or Taylor, like just applying Taylor's broadsword lesson to cutlass, which is something that I don't think Taylor, but a lot of broadsword manuals of the period say is just, cutlass is basically just the exact same thing as broadsword. And when you get into the later 19th century, there's a lot of fencing room manuals that say basically the same thing, that saber and cutlass have the exact same techniques used for them. It's just one is slightly longer than the other. But yeah, Pringle Green is a little bit outside the norm, but I guess tonight is going to be about looking at fencing that was a bit outside the norm. So yeah, I'm just going to pause recording before we launch into the first lesson, and yeah, then we'll be back in just a moment.